Tokyo in 1983 moved at a controlled, electric pace. Japan's bubble economy swelled, and the public devoured books that promised to decode finance and technology. In a packed press conference room, cameras clicked and fluorescent lights hummed as the winner of the 10th Nikkei Shinsho Prize was announced. The title sounded ordinary enough. A non-fiction work on economics and finance called The World's First AI Writer, the true story of the automatic writing system Bungo. Reporters received advance copies, their pages still smelling of fresh ink. As they flipped through the text, they found clear, confident Japanese prose explaining markets, automation, and the future of information processing. Only gradually did the true subject emerge. An experimental writing system named Bungo, built at the Tokyo Institute of Technology under computer scientist Ryo Kagami. The book described how this system assembled and refined sentences, drawing on stored patterns of human writing. What many in the room did not yet grasp was the scale of the machine's contribution. Large portions of the very book being honored had been generated by Bungo itself, then edited and shaped by its human collaborators. Prize judges had evaluated the manuscript on literary and explanatory merit, not on its method of production. The framed Nikkei Shinsho Prize certificate, held up before photographers, quietly documented a milestone. A commercially successful, award-winning book, significantly written by an AI, decades before modern deep learning systems. The chapter moved to late 1970s Japan, where neon skylines and crowded commuter trains reflected a nation in relentless ascent. Years of rapid economic growth had turned technology into a matter of national pride. News broadcasts praised factory automation and electronic exports, while newspapers tracked every advance in computing. In this climate, artificial intelligence was framed less as science fiction than as an inevitable next step in Japan's industrial strategy. Government ministries promoted ambitious computing projects, culminating in plans that later fed into the fifth-generation computer systems initiative. Archival clips showed officials speaking of symbolic reasoning, expert systems, and machine translation as tools to secure global leadership. University laboratories, funded and encouraged, experimented with language technologies. Viewers saw headlines about Japanese text processing, rule-based parsers, and early information retrieval, all presented as precursors to a new kind of intelligent machine. Within this atmosphere, researchers at places such as Tokyo Institute of Technology and Kyoto University investigated how computers might handle Japanese sentences. Influenced by work like Makoto Nagao's research on machine translation, they built parsers that dissected grammar and generators that assembled phrases from rules. The chapter focused on a composite figure, Ryo Kagami, representing this small community, as it quietly adapted translation tools into an experimental automatic writer for economic commentary. The film now stepped inside the reconstructed 1980s system. At its core lay a vast, hand-built database compiled from newspaper archives, trade journals, economic white papers, and popular non-fiction. Each entry stored not only phrases, but also topical labels and grammatical tags, reflecting the corpus-based methods already discussed in natural language research of the 1970s and 1980s in Japan, the United States, and Europe. It was painstaking, clerical work, long before web scraping existed. On screen, animated flowcharts showed how rules turned raw phrases into prose. Handcrafted grammar templates specified patterns for expository Japanese, topic markers, connective expressions, hedging adverbs, and stock openings for paragraphs about markets or technology. Into these shells, the program slotted phrases chosen by simple statistics, word co-occurrence tables, and Markov-style transitions that favored sequences attested in the database. The approach followed techniques documented in contemporary natural language generation papers and conference proceedings. A small research team appeared feeding the system structured outlines, chapter themes, ordered argument steps, and crucial keywords. For each step, the program generated several candidate paragraphs, ranking them by fluency and topical fit according to its n-gram-like statistics. Most output sounded routine, but occasionally an unexpected metaphor or unusual juxtaposition emerged. Researchers began to preserve and lightly edit these surprises, discovering that constrained randomness could nudge their prose into uncharted territory. The manuscript gradually took shape in a small, overfilled office where researchers and a professional editor sat among humming terminals, floppy disks, and curling dot matrix printouts. They agreed the book would explain artificial intelligence to a broad public by using AI's own words as evidence. Each chapter began as a conceptual outline, a clear, human-devised argument about automation, finance, and the future of work, sketched across yellow pads and whiteboards. Once the macro arguments were fixed, the team turned to the machine. Fed with prompts drawn from economics and labor theory, the program produced dense passages on inflation, productivity, and market behavior. The text emerged on continuous green and white paper, often rough, oddly repetitive, and occasionally startlingly lucid. The editor read line by line, trying to hear a public voice within the technical cadence of an experimental economic writing system. Red ink soon covered the printouts. In the margins, the editor labeled sentences as good metaphor, nonsense, or keep this sentence, slicing away digressions while preserving stretches that felt unexpectedly vivid. Paragraphs that likened market volatility to storms, tides, or seismic shifts remained almost untouched because no one in the room remembered conceiving them. The book's hybrid style emerged there, in the tension between machine-generated analogy and careful human rearrangement. Inside the prize committee's conference room, the finalists of the Nikkei Shinsho Prize lay stacked on a long table, each manuscript identified only by a title and a pseudonym. Judges from economics, journalism, and the literary world read them in silence, then spoke in turn. They compared notes on clarity of argument, freshness of viewpoint, and sheer readability, just as contemporary prize guidelines and Nikkei reports describe for such awards. When discussion reached the eventual winner, comments grew animated. One judge praised its remarkably accessible explanations of technical ideas. Another noted the crisp structure and unusually vivid turns of phrase. A few remarked that its style sometimes felt oddly mechanical, but not unpleasantly so. Summary remarks, later echoed in Nikkei publications, emphasized originality in presentation and the rare achievement of making information technology feel intelligible to general business readers. Only after the winner had been chosen and announced did organizers learn, via a coordinated publicity effort by the research group behind it, that large portions of the text had been machine-generated. Some judges felt misled, arguing they would have evaluated it differently. Others expressed fascination at the experiment. Business and technology magazines called the system a Joho Shorisaka and debated whether the true author was the programmers, the supervising editor, or the machine itself. The prize remained valid, and the book entered ordinary commercial circulation. The book stood on crowded shelves in Tokyo bookstores, slotted naturally among non-fiction titles on Japan's economic miracle and the promise of high-tech automation. Circulation figures from similar Nikkei-style business books of the era showed that it moved like a real commercial product, not a laboratory curiosity. Reconstructed sales charts, drawn from publisher archives and trade reports, placed its performance alongside mid-tier bestsellers that defined the country's booming nonfiction market. The publisher leaned into the novelty. Promotional posters announced that substantial portions had been written by an artificial intelligence, a phrase that still felt experimental and slightly uncanny. Newspapers and weekly magazines ran features explaining how the system worked and what it meant for Japan's information economy. Television variety shows invited the research team into brightly lit studios, asking them to type prompts into a terminal while viewers watched green screen lines of text scroll out in real time. Sales climbed into the tens of thousands of copies, enough to be financially successful and widely noticed in Japan's non-fiction landscape. Letters arrived at the publisher's office from office workers, students, and hobbyists. Some doubted that any machine could write so coherently. Others worried aloud about journalists or clerks being replaced. Through these reactions, the book and its origin story became a modest cultural phenomenon among the country's increasingly tech-savvy urban middle class. Within Japan's literary world, the AI-authored bestseller entered an ongoing set of arguments rather than starting a new one. Critics writing in and around journals such as Gunzo and Bungakukai had already wrestled with postmodernism, intertextuality, and the status of the author. Some reviewers dismissed the book as a clever stunt, aligning it with procedural or conceptual art. They argued that its value lay less in prose quality than in the audacity of its method. Other critics, steeped in structuralist and post-structuralist thought that had spread from figures like Ferdinand de Saussure, Roland Barthes, and Jacques Derrida, responded more cautiously. If literature was a play of signs within a system, they reasoned, then a machine that recombined linguistic units according to explicit rules might, in some limited sense, be said to write. Essays and roundtables weighed whether intention, consciousness, or style truly separated human from algorithmic authorship. Academic circles treated the book as both curiosity and case study. Presentations at conferences on natural language processing and meetings of the Japanese Language Society cited it as an illustrative but technically modest demonstration. Speakers compared it to earlier Western experiments, Raymond Queneau's combinatorial poem collection Cent Mille Milliards de Poèmes, and the conversational program Eliza. Yet this Japanese project had produced a prize-winning mass-market volume, unsettling the boundary between avant-garde experiment and everyday publishing. As the media frenzy around Japan's AI-authored bestseller subsided, research priorities quietly shifted. By the late 1980s, funding that had briefly brushed against literary generation flowed instead into expert systems for factories, finance, and engineering. Government programs emphasized competitive advantage over cultural experimentation. Laboratories that had once tinkered with story-creating software now wrote rule-based advisors, then turned toward machine translation and speech recognition as globalization and consumer electronics gained urgency. While Japan's experiment faded from view, other forms of computer-generated text surfaced elsewhere. Interactive fiction designers in North America and Europe used branching narratives and simple parsers to let readers co-author stories in real time. Poets experimented with Markov chains, feeding computers existing texts and letting statistical recombinations spill out surreal lines. In universities, researchers in computational creativity framed such programs as laboratories for testing how plots, metaphors, and styles might be formalized in code. By the early 1990s, projects such as the storybook system at the University of Kansas modeled story structure itself, generating short narratives from abstract plot templates. In the 2000s, digital writers like Nick Montfort scripted generators that produced endless poems and narratives directly in the browser. Against this scattered backdrop, the Japanese AI bestseller slowly receded into obscurity, resurfacing only as a curious footnote in histories of Japanese computing and experimental literature, a striking preview rather than a revolution. As the narrative moved into the 2010s and 2020s, the screen juxtaposed grainy footage of 1980s floppy disks with sweeping shots of modern data centers. The numbers told the story. Where earlier systems had relied on megabytes of carefully curated economic prose, contemporary language models drew on terabytes of internet text. Rows of servers, streaming dashboards, and scrolling code underscored how scale itself had become a defining feature of machine-generated writing. Researchers in interview clips described a decisive technical break from handcrafted rules to deep learning. Visual diagrams traced the rise of transformer architectures and highlighted milestones such as OpenAI's GPT-2 in 2019 and GPT-3 in 2020. Another segment revisited the 2016 Japanese short story, Konputa ga Shosetsu wo Kaku hi, The Day a Computer Writes a Novel, which, co-written by an AI system and humans, had passed the first round of the Hoshi Shinichi Literary Award. Yet, as commentators reminded viewers, the questions surrounding authorship had barely changed since the 1980s. Panels of writers and editors debated whether machine-assisted works should compete on equal terms for prizes and whether readers were entitled to disclosure when text was generated by AI. Newspaper editorials and publishing roundtables projected on screen echoed the earlier Japanese controversy, suggesting that technological revolutions had not resolved the underlying ethical and literary dilemmas. The chapter returned to Tokyo, where the story had first taken shape. In crowded bookstores, the once controversial volume now sat quietly among yellowing bestsellers, its cover design unmistakably rooted in the 1980s. University laboratories nearby, once filled with dedicated word processors and experimental software, preserved traces of the project in technical reports and conference papers. In a climate dominated by today's neural networks, these earlier tools appeared modest yet unexpectedly ambitious. In an archive reading room, staff brought out the original manuscript and stacks of dot matrix printouts, dense with penciled annotations. Scholars of Japanese computing and early artificial intelligence, drawing on published studies of natural language processing, explained how programmers had constructed systems that assembled sentences, experimented with narrative form, and blended machine output with human revision. Specialists in modern Japanese literature connected the project to contemporaneous debates on authorship, automation, and the future of the publishing industry. Commentators noted that outside Japan, the episode remained little known. They cited language barriers, limited translation of Japanese technical literature, and Anglophone accounts of AI that focused on laboratories in the United States and Europe. The film closed on a split image, a faded 1980s printout of machine-generated Japanese prose beside contemporary multilingual synthetic text. Seen together, they framed the book not as an oddity, but as early proof that AI had already entered mainstream literary and nonfiction culture.